the place where they were shooting the people at the wall. I remember the hangings. I remember the horror. I remember the smoke of the chimney coming out.
When a construction crew swings a sledgehammer into a basement wall, expecting old pipes, but finding a tragic part of history instead, it's not a good sign. For 80 years, these tiny, hidden cells sat in total darkness, holding on to the final, desperate scratches of people the Nazis tried to make the world forget. It's not just some dusty history lesson, but a chilling look at what happens when secrets finally run out of room. The walls are finally talking, and the story they're telling is heavy. These prison cells are just unforgivable. The day the hammer hit history. So you're just a simple guy, just a regular contractor, working a construction gig in an old Berlin basement or a Polish sub-cellar. You're there to clear out some moldy drywall and rusted pipes so a new tech startup or a trendy cafe can move in. You swing a heavy sledgehammer, expecting the dull, solid thud of brick, but instead, the wall gives way with a hollow, sighing crunch that sounds like the building itself is exhaling. You peer through the swirling gray dust with your flashlight, and instead of a crawl space or a sewer line, you see a heavy, rusted iron door with a sliding peephole that hasn't been touched since your grandfather was a toddler. It's not a movie plot. This is exactly how these secret Nazi prison cells have been popping up across Europe lately. It's like the city has been holding its breath for 80 years, and someone finally poked a deep, painful hole in its chest. For decades, these specific places weren't on any official maps or tourist brochures. We all know about the massive, sprawling concentration camps because they were too big to hide. But the Nazis were also obsessed with a different kind of erasure, the night and fog disappearances. They didn't always need a train car and a barbed wire fence to break someone. Sometimes they just needed the basement of a regular apartment building or a boring government office that looked completely normal from the street. When the war ended and the Soviet or Allied troops moved in, the chaos was so absolute that many of these smaller, local torture chambers were simply walled off. People were desperate to move on. They put up a new layer of brick, slapped on some cheap gray paint, and went about their lives. For 80 years, residents walked over these floors, cooked dinner, and raised kids. While just a few feet below their slippers, the evidence of nightmare-level cruelty sat in total, pitch-black silence. Opening these cells today feels fundamentally different than looking at a museum exhibit behind velvet ropes. In a museum, everything is curated, cleaned up, and labeled with helpful little placards. But in these hidden cells, the air is still thick and heavy with the smell of damp earth, old iron, and a lingering sense of dread. When the light hits the walls, you see things that shouldn't be there. You see scratch marks near the floor, where someone, tucked away in the dark, tries to find a sliver of light or a breath of air. You see heavy metal hooks bolted into the low ceilings that definitely weren't meant for hanging up winter coats. It's a raw, unfiltered punch to the gut that reminds you history isn't something that happened a long time ago in a black and white movie. It's literally under our feet, tucked behind the dry wall of a renovated basement, waiting for a construction worker to swing a hammer and let the ghosts out. Building these secret cages wasn't just a random act of cruelty, it was a carefully designed system of shadows. The Hitler Directive. If you were walking down a typical street in Berlin, Warsaw, or Paris in 1942, everything probably looked eerie but strangely functional. You'd see the baker, the postman, and the local police officer. But what you wouldn't see, what the Nazi regime went to extreme lengths to bury, was the shadow prison system. This wasn't the work of a few rogue soldiers, it was a masterclass in architectural gaslighting. They didn't just build prisons, they engineered a way to make people vanish, while their neighbors were upstairs eating dinner or listening to the radio. The anatomy of secrecy was built on a foundation of mundane, everyday boredom. You could be living in a nice third-floor apartment with lace curtains, totally unaware that 3 stories beneath your feet, in a space meant for coal storage or wine racks, The Gestapo had installed soundproofed doors and heavy-duty shackles. It was a terrifyingly normal kind of evil that relied on the architecture of the city to act as a silencer. Now let's look at the Nacht und Nebel, or Night and Fog, decree. This was Hitler's personal directive aimed at political activists and resistance fighters in occupied territories. The whole point wasn't just to kill them. It was to make them evaporate. If you kill a man publicly, you make a martyr. If a man simply walks out for a loaf of bread and never comes back, no body, no grave, no record of an arrest, you create a vacuum of pure, paralyzing fear. These secret basement cells were the physical manifestation of that vacuum. They were often located in Hausgefängnisse, or house prisons. These weren't grand buildings with towers and searchlights. They were converted villas, former basements of insurance companies, or the cellars of local police precincts that had been requisitioned by the SS. The secrecy was so tight that even the low-level soldiers guarding the front door often didn't know exactly who was downstairs or how many people were being held in the sublevels. The design of these spaces was brutally efficient. They weren't built for long-term stays. They were built for breaking spirits. Because they were often tucked into residential or commercial basements, the Nazis had to get creative with soundproofing. They would use layers of earth, heavy felt, or even double-thick brick walls to ensure that the screams of a resistance fighter wouldn't drift up through the floorboards to the civilian world above. This created a literal two-world system, the world of sunlight, laundry, and grocery lists on top, and a world of cold concrete and iron bars directly beneath. Architects were brought in to draft blueprints for these conversions, treating the installation of a torture rack with the same professional detachment they'd use for a new heating system. They would install specialized drainage for cleaning the cells, heavy-duty ventilation that didn't connect to the rest of the building's air ducts, and light switches that could only be operated from the outside. When the war ended, this secrecy became the perfect camouflage. Unlike the massive crematoriums of Auschwitz, which stood as undeniable monuments to genocide, a basement cell just looks like a basement. When the Nazis realized the end was coming, they didn't just run, they tried to delete the evidence. They burned the paper trails, executed the remaining witnesses, and in many cases, they simply bricked up the cell doors. If you have a large basement and you build a wall 5 feet inward from the original back wall, the room just looks slightly smaller. Unless you have the original architectural blueprints from 1920, you'd never know there was a dead space behind that brickwork. For 80 years, that dead space held the air of the 40s, the smell of sweat and fear, and the physical proof of a system designed to make human beings disappear into the fog. It took 80 years for our modern hammers to finally catch up with their old lies. Once the dust settled, the real horror wasn't what was gone, but what remained etched in stone. If walls could talk, when the restoration teams finally stepped into these dead spaces, they didn't just find empty concrete boxes, they found a frantic, frozen conversation etched into the limestone and plaster. Imagine standing in a room no bigger than a walk-in closet, clicking on a high-powered LED work light, and seeing thousands of tiny, jagged marks covering every square inch of the walls, from the floor to as high as a human arm could reach. These aren't just random scratches. These are the wall chronicles, the last-ditch effort of people who knew they were being erased from the surface of the earth. When you're trapped in a night and fog cell, your name is the only thing you truly own, and the Nazis spent every waking hour trying to strip that away from you. In response, the prisoners turned the very walls of their cages into a diary of defiance. They used whatever they had: a loosened nail, a sharp pebble, a piece of charcoal smuggled in a pocket, or even their own fingernails until the tips bled. They carved into the stone because stone is harder to burn than paper. They knew that even if they didn't make it out, the wall might survive the war. They were betting their legacy on the hope that someone, 80 years later, would eventually swing a hammer and read what they had to say. The most common thing you see when you look at these inscriptions is a name and a date. It sounds simple, almost boring, until you realize what that name represents. It's a fixed point in a world that was trying to turn them into a ghost. You'll see Joseph K., June 1944, or Marie L., December 8, 43. Beside these names, you often see a tally system, 4 vertical lines and a diagonal slash, tracking the days spent in total darkness. Some of these tallies go on for months, wrapping around the corners of the room like a grim wallpaper. You can almost feel the passage of time slowing down as the marks get shakier toward the end of the sequence. These people were fighting a war against insanity in a soundproofed basement where you can't see the sun or hear the birds. The only way to stay human is to keep track of the rhythm of the world outside. When a prisoner carves "Today is Sunday," they aren't just stating a fact. They are reclaiming their connection to the living. They are refusing to let the Gestapo dictate the boundaries of their reality. But then you look closer, and the messages get more personal, more gut-wrenching. In one cell found beneath an old apartment block in Warsaw, researchers found a message that simply read, "I am innocent. Tell my mother." There was no address, no last name, just a desperate plea cast into the void. It's the kind of thing that stops your heart because you realize that for 80 years, that message was sitting in the dark, and his mother likely went to her grave never knowing where her son spent his final hours. In another cell in Berlin, someone had carved a tiny, incredibly detailed calendar with little drawings for holidays. There was a small sketch of a Christmas tree next to a December date. It's these flashes of normalcy that are the most haunting. These weren't historical figures in the way we think of them. They were people who missed their wives, people who were worried about their kids' homework, and people who just wanted a decent cup of coffee. The walls reflect that humanity in a way that a textbook never could. You see poems, lyrics to folk songs, and even recipes carved into the plaster, a way to feast in their minds while their stomachs were shrinking from starvation. There's also a heavy layer of religious and political defiance. You'll find Stars of David carved right next to Catholic crosses, showing that in the depths of these secret prisons, the shared experience of suffering often broke down the walls between different faiths. One prisoner in a Parisian basement cell spent what must have been days carving a perfect, ornate crucifix into the stone, using the texture of the wall to give the figure of Christ a haunting, three-dimensional look. Others left political slogans, "Vive la France" or "Rot Front." These were the ultimate middle fingers to the regime. The Nazis wanted these people to feel small, broken, and forgotten. By carving a giant, defiant slogan into the very infrastructure of the Reich, the prisoners were saying, "You can lock me in this basement, but you haven't won." They were turning their prison into a monument of resistance, while the guards were upstairs laughing and drinking schnapps. The most chilling part of analyzing these walls is the conversations that happened across time. Because these cells were used for years, different prisoners would occupy the same space. You can see where one person started a message, and someone else, weeks or months later, finished it or added a comment underneath. It's like a prehistoric social media feed for the condemned. One person might carve, "Do not lose hope," and beneath it, in different handwriting, someone else added, "We are still here." It was a way of passing the torch in the dark. It gave the next person who was thrown into that hole a reason to keep breathing for one more hour. They were building a community of ghosts, connected by the scratches they left in the lime. When modern historians find these rooms, they don't just take pictures and move on. They use 3D laser scanning and specialized lighting to catch the shallowest indentations that the human eye can't see. They've found that many walls have layers. The Nazis would sometimes slap a thin coat of plaster over the inscriptions to hide them, only for the next prisoner to scratch through that layer and find the names of those who came before. It's a literal archaeological onion of human misery and strength. Every name recovered is a victory against the night and fog policy. Every date verified is a lie exposed. These walls were never meant to be seen by us. They were meant to be the final barrier between a human life and the rest of history. But the stone held on to the truth better than the people did. It's one thing to find these cells in a war zone, but the real shock is how close they were to the normal world. The logistics of fear. If you were to look at the blueprints of a typical European city in the late 30s, you'd see a grid of functionality: bakeries, post offices, insurance firms, and apartment blocks. But the Nazi logistics of fear relied on a parasitic relationship with this boring, everyday architecture. They didn't just build prisons on the outskirts of town. They hollowed out the city from the inside like a termite infestation. The most chilling part of these recent discoveries isn't that these cells existed, it's where they were located. We're finding them in the basements of ordinary residential buildings where families were raising kids, in the sublevels of tax offices, and even tucked behind the wine cellars of fancy hotels. This was neighborhood-level terror. It meant that while you were upstairs complaining that your neighbor's radio was too loud, there might have been 3 people shackled to a radiator directly beneath your floorboards. The choice of these locations was a cold, calculated logistical move. Moving prisoners through the streets in broad daylight is messy. It draws eyes and creates rumors. But if you requisition a basement in a standard block of flats, you can pull a black Mercedes up to a side door at 3 a.m., slide a hooded figure through a service entrance, and they effectively cease to exist. To the world outside, that building is just number 42 Schmidt Street. To the Gestapo, it was a Hausgefängnis, a house prison. These sites were chosen specifically because they didn't look like prisons. They lacked the high walls, the barbed wire, and the armed towers that usually scream danger. By hiding the machinery of torture inside the skin of a normal city, the Nazis made the entire urban landscape a potential trap. You never knew if the building next door was a library or a black site. Think about the sheer technical effort it took to maintain this normal facade. They had to deal with the logistics of noise, smell, and waste without tipping off the civilians living just a few feet away. In many of the cells recently uncovered, researchers found specialized soundproofing made of thick layers of peat, cork, or even recycled rags stuffed into the ceiling joists. This wasn't just for the prisoners' benefit, it was so the sound of a scream wouldn't interrupt a bureaucrat's lunch on the first floor. They also had to bypass standard plumbing. In several secret cells found in Berlin, the Gestapo had installed independent drainage systems that bypassed the main building's pipes, ensuring that any evidence washed away wouldn't clog the neighborhood sewers and cause a public health investigation. It was a terrifyingly professional approach to domestic horror. The logistics also extended to the ghost staff who ran these places. These weren't usually the frontline soldiers you see in war movies. They were administrative SS officers, men who carried briefcases, wore spectacles, and looked like bank tellers. They would arrive at a standard office building at 9 a.m., nod to the doorman, and descend into the sub-basement to spend 8 hours interrogating people in the dark. At 5 p.m., they'd come back up, brush the dust off their lapels, and go home to their wives and children. This compartmentalization is what allowed the secret cells to stay secret for so long. The people living nearby were encouraged to look the other way, and the people working inside were masters of the mundane. Even the delivery of supplies was handled with a dark kind of efficiency. Food for the prisoners, usually just watery soup or a crust of bread, was often brought in through the same back alleys used for coal deliveries. The sheer ordinariness of the activity provided the perfect camouflage. For 80 years, that camouflage held. Because these cells were integrated into the literal bones of the city, they didn't look like historical sites when the war ended. They looked like storage units. They looked like that weirdly cold room in the basement we don't use. By weaving their terror into the logistics of daily life, the Nazis ensured that even after they were gone, their secrets would be physically supported by the very homes and offices of the people who survived them. Behind the logistics and the concrete, there are the names, the individual souls who were never supposed to be found. The human element. When you peel back the layers of 80-year-old plaster and soot, you aren't just looking at architecture. You're looking at a crime scene where the victims finally get to point a finger. The people held in these shadow prisons were known to historians as the disappeared. They were the ghosts in the machine, names on a Gestapo manifest that simply ended with a dash or a cryptic code. But as these cells have been cracked open, those codes are being turned back into human beings with favorite songs, annoying habits, and families who never stopped looking for them. These ghost prisoners were often the best of their generation: student leaders, underground journalists, or just regular shopkeepers who refused to sell out their Jewish neighbors. By uncovering their cells, we are finally inviting them back into the light of history. Take the story of a young woman whose name was found scratched into a basement wall in a residential part of Lyon, France. Her name was Simone, and for years her family only knew that she'd been picked up by the butcher of Lyon, Klaus Barbie. They assumed she'd been sent straight to a camp, but the discovery of a hidden subcellar in an old apartment building revealed a different, more intimate horror. Simone hadn't just vanished. She had been held in a room no bigger than a coffin for 3 weeks. On the wall, she hadn't written a manifesto or a grand political statement. She had scratched a series of names: her sisters, her parents, and a man named Jean. Beneath the names, she wrote, "Do not forget that I loved the sun." It's a line that hits you like a physical blow. In that damp, pitch-black hole, her biggest fear wasn't death. It was that the world would forget she was a girl who loved the warmth of a summer afternoon. Then there are the janitors of resistance, the people who were kept in these cells specifically because they had information the Nazis wanted. In a secret cell found beneath a former administrative building in Prague, researchers identified the marks of a man who had been a high-ranking member of the Czech underground. The Gestapo had kept him in a specialized isolation box, a cell so small he couldn't sit down or lie for over a month. They wanted the names of his couriers. For 30 days, he lived in a space that was essentially a vertical coffin. When the room was finally opened in the 2010s, they found that he had used his own blood to paint a tiny, defiant flag of his country on the back of the door where the guards wouldn't see it when they opened it. He never gave up the names. He died in that cell, alone, but the discovery of his blood flag, 80 years later, turned a forgotten basement into a shrine of human willpower. The human element also includes the sheer, heartbreaking domesticity of survival. In a cell complex found in a Berlin basement that had been used as a laundromat for 50 years after the war, historians found a stash of contraband hidden in a hollowed-out brick. It wasn't a weapon or a map. It was a collection of buttons, a piece of colorful ribbon, and a tiny, hand-carved wooden bird. One of the prisoners, likely a woman based on the inscriptions nearby, had spent her time in the dark creating beauty out of trash. It's a reminder that even when the Reich tried to turn people into subhumans or pieces, Stücke, the prisoners fought back by remaining artists, mothers, and dreamers. They refused to be just a number in a ledger. They held on to their humanness with a grip so tight it left physical marks on the world. Reclaiming these identities is a painstaking process. Historians have to cross-reference the names found on the walls with dusty, half-burned archives from the International Tracing Service. Sometimes it leads to a Hollywood moment where a 90-year-old survivor or a grandchild is called and told, "We found where he was." One elderly woman in Poland was finally able to visit the basement where her father had been held before his execution. She touched the wall where he had carved her name, and she said it felt like she was finally holding his hand after 80 years of searching the fog. These aren't just finds, they are reunions. They are the final closing of a door that the Nazis tried to leave hanging open forever. But the most haunting ghost prisoners are the ones we still can't identify. For every Simone or Josef whose story we piece together, there are 10 more who only left a single mark or a desperate X. These are the ones who were truly erased, whose families died in the same war, and whose names have been scrubbed by time. Standing in their cells is a heavy experience, because you realize you are the first person to acknowledge their existence in nearly a century. You become a witness to a life that the regime tried to delete entirely. But as we pull these stories from the shadows, we're running into a new problem. What do we do with the buildings that held them? The preservation battle. Now, here is where things get messy and modern. You'd think that finding a secret Nazi prison cell would be an automatic stop-everything moment. But in cities like Berlin or Warsaw, where every square inch of land is worth a fortune, history and real estate are in a constant, high-stakes wrestling match. This is the preservation battle, and it's a fight over what we owe the dead versus what we need for the living. When a developer buys an old, crumbling apartment block to turn it into luxury lofts, and a contractor finds those telltale iron doors in the basement, the clock starts ticking. For the developer, that discovery is a nightmare. It means delays, expensive archaeological surveys, and the stigma of having a torture chamber beneath the gym floor. For historians, it's a sacred site that must be saved at all costs. This tension creates a bizarre, quiet war behind the scenes. In some cases, developers have been caught trying to accidentally demolish these spaces before they can be officially designated as landmarks. They'll claim the wall was structurally unsound, or that they didn't realize what the inscriptions were. It's a race against the wrecking ball. On the other side, you have local activists and descendants of the resistance who argue that turning these cells into storage lockers or bike rooms is a second kind of erasure. They believe that if you pave over the dark spots of a city, you eventually lose the map of its soul. They want these basements turned into small, micro-museums, places where you can walk down the stairs and feel the temperature drop, literally and emotionally. But how many museums can one city actually hold? This is the practical side of the argument that gets people heated. Berlin, for example, is practically a graveyard with a subway system. If every basement where a Gestapo officer slapped a prisoner was turned into a protected memorial, the city would become a frozen monument to 1945, unable to grow or house its current residents. There's a psychological weight to living in a place where the walls are always heavy. Some residents argue that they shouldn't have to live in a funeral parlor, while others feel that ignoring the history is a form of complicity. It's a delicate balance between never forget and let us live. The compromise usually ends up being a partial preservation, which is its own kind of weirdness. You might see a modern office building with a glass floor in the lobby, showing a single preserved cell underneath, like a historical fishbowl. It's a bit surreal to see people in business suits walking over a site of absolute human misery while checking their emails. Critics say it turns trauma into a decorator's touch, while supporters say it's the only way to keep the memory visible in a world that's constantly moving on. This battle isn't just about bricks and mortar. It's about how we choose to integrate our scars into our everyday lives. Finding these cells 80 years later isn't just about the past. It's a wake-up call for the world we're building right now. Don't forget to click subscribe if you liked this video. We got more. Just click on the next one right there on your screen.